Hey folks, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and we are finishing up our discussion of language and cognitive psychology this semester by talking about language comprehension. Now, before I begin, I do want to talk about something that I did not necessarily bring up in the lectures, but I have been kind of talking about a little bit. So when we talk about semantics, we're talking about meaning. When we talk about phonetics or phonemes, we're talking about sound. Now, when we talk about language comprehension, one thing that we are going to focus on here is what's called parsing. Now, parsing is when we try to understand the syntax of an utterance or a sentence or a phrase. Now, the syntax is basically what we tend to think of when we think of the order of words in a sentence, the position of items, and kind of its grammatical structure. So when we talk about syntax, we're talking about the order of something. And understanding what syntax is going to become really important as we talk more about language comprehension. So what next? So we're going to talk a little bit about how we process and understand phrases and sentences and stories. And at least at this point, there's not really that much difference between the written and the spoken language. And so when we talk about analyzing the different utterances that people say or different phrases that we read, there are two different levels of analysis. There's what is referred to as parsing. So as I've mentioned, parsing is when we're trying to understand the syntactical relationship, the syntax that's going on, the order of words and the arrangement of words. And then there's pragmatics, the underlying meaning of that particular utterance, not necessarily the semantics, but the underlying message that somebody is trying to get across. So this can include things like taking turns in conversation, text organization, and making inferences. So what the underlying meaning of this overall utterance that somebody is actually trying to tell you. So what is parsing? So parsing is when we are analyzing the syntax or the grammatical structure of sentences. The big issue in parsing is when are different types of information used? When should we be focusing on the syntax? When should we be focusing on the underlying semantics, the meanings of these words? And most of the studies that we're going to talk about are going to use the English language. So some of that is going to be a limitation because the English language is largely a subject-verb-object language or an SVO language, and not all of the world's languages are subject-verb-object. And so we do have some limitations here. So how do we understand parsing? Do we have to understand the order and the underlying grammatical structure of the sentence before we can understand what it means, or does meaning and the underlying semantics come first? So there have been four major possibilities that have been assumed here. So some people say you have to understand the syntax before you can understand anything else. So the idea is that the syntactical analysis actually comes first. Other people will say that the semantic analysis comes first. You have to understand the words that are being said and the meaning before you can actually process anything else. Other people have said that both of these happen simultaneously. And others have said that they don't necessarily happen simultaneously, but one can bridge into the other. It's very closely associated. They're very similar to each other, if not simultaneous, and they kind of have this hand-in-glove relationship. They're each independent of each other, but they bridge towards each other while not being simultaneous. So we have to think about grammar and syntax. Now, one of the things that is wonderful about our language is that it is incredibly productive. We can form an infinite number of sentences that have never actually been said before. So for example, that blue fan is looking at me funny. Odds are pretty good nobody has said that before, or maybe not that exact range of sentences. But what's really important here is, despite the fact that you can basically make any potential sentence on earth, we still have these underlying rules of grammar. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is that many of us internalize these rules of grammar very, very early on in life before we actually have a formal understanding of language. So I remember being older, maybe in 7th grade, and being like, why do I have to diagram sentences? Why do I need to learn about the rules of a language that I already speak? And as a kind of to my 7th grade self, I get that. Most of us are pretty good at using grammatically correct sentences, even if we've never actually used grammar. But the truth of the matter is that when you understand what these rules are, you can see, first of all, you can make your sentences better. You can also understand you understand how language works in a clearer, more concrete way. And it also gives you information that you can use for any future languages that you learn. So we have this grammar. It is a set of rules to account for the productivity, which is basically we can produce or create any type of sentence on earth. That's what productivity is. We can create a variety of different sentences. Regularity is basically the idea that no matter how many sentences you form, they all tend to have the same subject, verb, object structure. And so basically what this does is it generates, when we have a grammar, all sentences that are grammatically permissible. So for example, what are we more likely to say? Are we more likely to say Matthew is likely to leave or Matthew is probable to leave? Odds are pretty good we'll realize that Matthew is likely to leave is more grammatically correct than Matthew is probable to leave. Even if we can't necessarily articulate why one is correct and the other is not, we do have these intuitions of grammar that we pick up that say, I know that Matthew is likely to leave is correct. I may not be able to explain why, but I at least know that that is the more grammatically correct form. So here's where it gets kind of difficult though. Sometimes parsing and trying to suss out this grammatical structure can be really difficult because we have syntactic or structural ambiguity. And so because we are so good, remember that most parsing studies look at the English language. If you are a native English speaker, or if you have been speaking English for well over 10 years, you are probably an expert in English, which means that parsing is something that comes very, very easily to you. And because of that, it makes it hard to study. So what we'll end up doing instead is presenting you with these ambiguous sentences to force you to kind of slow down so that we can study how parsing works, because parsing normally is too quick for us to study because we're really good at sussing these things out. So how do we work out situations of structural ambiguity? Well, first of all, we can go back to those prosodic cues. We can focus on the stress of words or the intonation of words. But ultimately, the overall pattern of the sentence itself is more important. So when I give you the sentence, I met the daughter of the colonel who was on the balcony, this is an ambiguous sentence because we aren't entirely sure who's on the balcony. Is it the daughter or is it the colonel? So this is a case where our prosodic cues can help us. I met the daughter of the colonel who was on the balcony. That doesn't really seem to help very much. So we have some other linguistic intuitions in play that can help us figure this out. So my intuition when I read this sentence is that it's the colonel who was on the balcony, because who was on the balcony is closer to colonel than it is to daughter. If we were talking about the daughter, I would probably have a sentence like on the balcony, I met the daughter of the colonel. But because who was on the balcony is at the end of the sentence near colonel, I'm going to assume that this phrase is modifying colonel rather than balcony. So the overall pattern of how the sentence is structured might actually be more important than the prosodic cues like stress and intonation, which, as you kind of saw at least here, doesn't really do that much. So one of the ways that we can look at this is through something that is called a garden path sentence. So this is when we are basically misled by the structure of the sentence. So the idea here being the horse raced past the barn fell. Now you have to stop there for a minute because we get to the horse raced past the barn and you're like, oh, okay, that's fine. But then you get that extra word fell. You're like, what? So it's almost like I've led you down this garden path to expect a certain type of sentence representation. And then I basically said, oh, wait, here, the barn fell. What? And so this is what's referred to as the garden path theory. So this model was basically developed by Fraser and Rayner back in 1982. And basically, according to this model, only one syntactical structure is initially considered. So we're only focusing on the syntax. We don't really care about the meaning. So we first use syntactical information, and then basically in a second stage, that is when we start bringing in the semantic information to basically pick and disambiguate any other information. We are going to choose the simplest syntactical structure, and we're basically going to pick these on two different phenomena. First is what is referred to as minimal attachment, and then the second is what we refer to as late closure. So what do these mean? So minimal attachment is basically the idea that the structure that produces the fewest nodes is what we prefer. We want the simplest structure. So when we're talking about nodes, we're talking about the major parts of a sentence. We're basically talking about phrases. So for example, we have the phrase, the girl knew the answer by heart. By heart is modifying how much she knew the answer. So this is not necessarily a new phrasal, a new phrase. This is a modifier. Compared to something like the girl knew the answer was wrong, this is actually a new phrase. And thus, this particular utterance has fewer nodes and a simpler syntactical structure than the girl knew the answer was wrong, because this is a brand new verb phrase. This is kind of an adverb in this case. The other principle is the principle of late closure. So basically, if we are adding new words, we are going to attach them to the current phrase or the clause if permissible. So for example, if we get this, since Jay always jogs, a mile seems like a short distance. We're basically going to attach a mile seems like a short distance to jogs, this previous phrase. So it seems like we have two sentences here, but what we actually have are two phrases that we could separate with a comma. So comma, or rather what this is, due to the principle of late closure, we're going to attach this to this prior phrase instead of making a new sentence. So we get something like this. Since Jay always jogs, comma, a mile seems like a short distance. So punctuation can be really useful for helping us disambiguate these garden paths, because that late closure can actually occasionally make things a little bit more ambiguous. Now, here's a little bit more about these principles because I know that they're kind of hard to understand. So this I actually dug up from Wikipedia. Wikipedia can be incredibly useful for some things. So late closure will cause new words or phrases to be attached to the current clause. So for example, John said he would leave yesterday would be parsed as John said he would leave yesterday, and not as John said he would leave yesterday. So we're going to have John said he would leave yesterday. So we're going to attach yesterday to this phrase and not yesterday being attached to John said. So we're going to have it as John saying he was going to leave yesterday rather than John said he would leave and spoke yesterday. So we're going to attach yesterday to this phrase. Late closure says we're actually going to attach it to he would leave yesterday. So hopefully this makes a little bit more sense to you. And minimal attachment is basically a strategy of parsimony. Basically, we're trying to go for the simplest syntactical structure, the one with the fewest phrasal nodes. Now, some other assumptions of the garden path model is that if there is a conflict between two principles, minimal attachment and late closure, we're going to default to minimal attachment. If our constructed structure is incompatible with the meaning, we're going to revise it using the rules of semantics. So context and semantics is not initially considered, only syntax is. And so because of this, there is no initial influence of prior context. That comes later for revisionary purposes. So what evidence do we actually have for the garden path model? So if I give you a sentence like this, put the apple on the towel in the box, does that mean I put the apple in the box or the apple on the towel in the box? So this is a case where context this is a pretty ambiguous sentence. So what's actually kind of interesting, we have the proportion of trials with fixations on the incorrect object. For ambiguous sentences, context actually has a very, very rapid effect on sentence interpretation. Now, this is really important because the garden path model says that context should not play a role initially. And you can kind of see here for ambiguous sentences, such as this one, as soon as I get a context that disambiguates what that is, notice how incorrect fixation drops. What this tells us is that we process context and we utilize context to better understand what a sentence is trying to tell us and assess the syntactical structure much sooner than the garden path model would suggest. So should we be led down the garden path? We do know that minimal attachment and late closure absolutely do influence our initial parsings, but word meaning can influence the initial structure. Prior context can also influence disambiguation. And it also doesn't really talk about how punctuation can help and how prosodic cues can help. So the garden path model is a very interesting way to start. And the garden path model assumes that syntax must be accessed first before meaning, but it's kind of clear that syntax, yes, we do access that, but we also access meaning as well. So the garden path model is a good start, but it's clear it's not an accurate depiction of what we do. So now we're going to talk about the constraint-based theories, so some other theories of parsing. So the initial interpretation basically comes from multiple sources that impose a limitation. So this was originally developed by McDonald and colleagues back in 1994, and it's basically the idea that all sources of information, including syntax, semantics, and lexical information, word knowledge, we use all of these things to try to limit what the potential syntactical structures, what the potential utterances and the structure that we want to parse could be. So all sources of information are considered. Different types of analyses are going to compete with each other, but we end up selecting the structure that has the strongest activation strength. And part of the reason that we become confused by ambiguous sentences is because the incorrect structure has more activation than other models, and the correct structure is less activated than other structures. Now, there are, according to this model, there are 4 different characteristics of language that help resolve our ambiguity. So first of all, grammatical knowledge helps constrain our interpretations. We're only going to pick those structures that are grammatically acceptable. We're not going to pick something that is ungrammatical. Additionally, when we are producing language, because we have a very set grammatical structure, and we have these grammatical rules, and we have to use language in certain ways, one of the things that is really helpful here is that language is far more predictable than we would expect it to be. And because of that, various types of information that is associated with a word are actually pretty dependent on each other. We have some predictability. Additionally, words are less ambiguous in some ways than others. Your book talks about the fact that if we consider words like duck and play, duck is more often used as a noun than a verb. Play is more often used as a verb than a noun, and because of that, because we have that knowledge, that can actually make it easier for us to parse. If we know that duck's a noun, most of the time that's going to be less ambiguous than when duck is a verb. Additionally, permissible interpretations vary in their frequency and in their probability, and this is where our past experience comes into play. We have heard certain types of words and certain types of phrases under certain expected contexts based on our experience, and we can use that prior knowledge to predict what kind of utterances are possible, which ones are not, and which ones are more likely or less likely. So we can use all of this information and the fact that language is not as unpredictable as we would expect to help us out. So what support do we have for constraint-based theories? So we're going to look at two different sentences. As the woman edited, the magazine amused all the reporters. As the woman sailed, the magazine amused all the reporters. So this is a case where we've got identical syntax, but the semantic constraints are going to differ here. So we could say this sentence, as the woman edited, the magazine amused all the reporters, there's more ambiguity here than there is in a sentence like, as the woman sailed, the magazine amused all the reporters. There's only one potential way that you can interpret this. As the woman sailed, comma, the magazine amused all the reporters. On the other hand, if I say, as the woman edited, comma, the magazine amused all the reporters, or it could be, as the woman edited the magazine, comma, amused all the reporters. Now that's not grammatically correct, but we have two different ways that we could think about what this means. We only have one here. A woman can't sail a magazine. It's just not going to happen. But a woman can sail. Now a woman can edit, or a woman can edit the magazine. So here we've got more semantic possibilities. Here we have more semantic constraints. And what we actually find, Pickering and Trexler presented people with these sentences, and because there are more ambiguities here, because there are more semantic possibilities, there are longer I fixations for the first sentence, despite the fact that the syntax is identical here. So we consider more than just syntax when we are processing sentences. Now, when we're talking about constraints, something that can be really important is the role of verb bias. So one of the things that we're going to find is the idea that verbs are often found more in some structures than as others. So for example, if we get the verb read, it's either going to exist as a verb with a direct object, such as I read the book, I read the magazine, or it will be a sentence complement. So I read quickly, I read slowly. And so typically we're not really going to see read in any other contexts besides those. So because we know that verbs are found more in some structures than others, this can actually help us resolve ambiguities and thus give us some more constraint with respect to trying to figure out which utterances are grammatically possible. And generally what we're going to find is that resolving sentence ambiguities happens much more quickly when that structure fits with a verb bias. So when we talk about the constraint model, is this model constrained too little or too much. So remember that the constraint-based model is basically the idea that all information is possible. Semantics, syntax, lexical information. And it is more efficient to use all possible information. We also found this with the triangle model with respect to reading. And unlike the garden path model, it does show that we use things like semantic information and context information very early. And because we can consider different sources of information, that makes it flexible. But first of all, we don't always use these constraints right away. We're talking about very simple sentence structures. We don't really spend a lot of time talking about complex structures, and we're talking about the fact that all of this information is presented in parallel and that these syntactic structures, these potential structures compete with each other and they're in parallel. But what evidence do we actually have for that? The model says that they're in parallel, but doesn't necessarily do a very good job of explaining why. So that is a case. Then we get to a model developed by Van Gompel and colleagues in 2000 called the unrestricted race model. So here is a case where all of the information, again, such as we saw with the constraint-based model, is used to identify the underlying syntactic structure. But it's basically kind of a horse race. So we're going to use all of this information to identify the syntactic structure. All other possible structures. So we're going to go with one structure. Any other structure is going to be ignored until we have enough information to disconfirm or rule out our favored syntactic structure. And if that initial structure is discarded, we reanalyze and we choose a new structure. So let's think about this. Which of these sentences is going to be processed fastest? So here's our first sentence. The burglar stabbed only the guy with the dagger during the night. Number 2, the burglar stabbed only the dog with the dagger during the night. 3, the burglar stabbed only the dog with the collar during the night. So here we have an ambiguity. Here we don't have an ambiguity. Here we have an even simpler structure. In this case, with the collar is modifying dog. Here with the dagger is modifying the burglar stabbing. So the predictions are as follows. The garden path says that due to deferring to minimal attachment, we're only 2 is actually going to be the fastest. I don't actually know that I would agree. I think that 3 might be the fastest. The constraint-based model says that 2 and 3 have identical sort of structures. It's just that the dagger is modifying a different part of the sentence than what the collar is modifying. So 2 and 3, because they have identical syntax, are going to be processed equally fast, but because one has an ambiguity, it's going to be processed the slowest. So we don't know if it's the burglar that has the dagger or the guy that has the dagger. We're not really sure which is which. In this case, we know that the dog can't have a dagger. And in this case, the collar is modifying dog. We know the burglar doesn't have the collar. So in these cases, the underlying structure is the same. Here, multiple possibilities are in play. Interestingly enough, the ambiguous sentence, that first sentence, is actually processed more quickly than the verb phrase attachment, which is the burglar stabbed only the dog with the dagger. In this case, with the dagger during the night modifies stabbed. So that's a noun, a verb phrase attachment. And then when we have the dog with the collar, that is a noun phrase attachment. So the dog has the collar. So verb phrase attachment and noun phrase attachment actually took longer to verify, despite the fact that they're not ambiguous. Now, according to the race model, the reason that ambiguous sentences will get processed more quickly is because when you have an ambiguous sentence, both syntactic structures are possible, and that thus you don't need to reanalyze anything because it will either be one or it will be the other. And so because of that, both syntactic structures are possible and you are processing those simultaneously according to the model. So finally, I want to talk about the concept of the good enough representation. So we did a lot of sentence diagramming when I was in school, and maybe you did. I don't necessarily know if it always helped out. But one of the things that we find, according to the concept of a good enough representation, is that parsing demands will often depend on our current situation. Like, we don't have to be perfect here. We just have to be able to understand it well enough to get through our day and deal with everyday issues. So oftentimes what we will do is heuristics can be used to simplify the task. So for example, remember that the English language is a subject, verb, object language. And because of that, many of our sentences tend to follow a structure of noun, verb, noun, subject, verb, object. So when we're trying to parse, we're going to assume that the sentence takes the structure of noun, verb, noun. Additionally, if we have a passive voice, that is another heuristic that we use. So if we want to basically take something from passive voice and put it into active voice, we need to focus on that noun, verb, noun structure. So if I say the ball was hit by the boy, we know that in passive voice, the ball is the object. Anything that is by the, anything that comes after by the is our subject, and that's our first noun, and then hit is our verb. So we can use that very, very quickly to help us navigate our day. Additionally, our goals for comprehension can ultimately change the thoroughness of these representations. If we're really trying to make an effort to listen, we're probably going to spend more time processing information if we really need to remember something for later than if we just need to get through our day. One of the things that your book actually mentions, interestingly enough, you're only going to process a sentence thoroughly if you have a reason to do so. So ambiguous sentences are often going to be read more rapidly according to the good enough representation. So because they don't care if they understand all of the details. They recognize it's ambiguous, and so ultimately the goal to try to be correct doesn't matter because it's an ambiguous sentence. It's a bad sentence. Why should I pay attention to it? Now that's kind of in comparison to something like the race model that says you've got both of these racing together at the same time. If it turns out that one doesn't work, you can pick the other and you don't have to reanalyze it because you're getting them both at the same time. So I think that's pretty interesting. So we're going to go ahead and stop here, and we will finish up in the next lecture.